Okay, thank you, Jenny. Thank you very much for being here today. I know that it's very busy with strikes, and clear an hour of your time is no small request, so thank you. So, as Jenny has introduced, I'm a cultural and social geographer. I have wide-ranging interests in feminist geopolitics, urban cultural economy, and qualitative research methods. Currently, I'm very lucky because I have just returned from a period of maternity leave to a sabbatical where I'll be finishing my fellowship. And the sabbatical is here in Valencia, so you can see me on the beach in Valencia with my son. And so that's where I'm living at the moment. My background is multidisciplinary, and I think that plays into my research, as you'll see. So my BA was in English Literature and Language here. I did my MA in Art Gallery Museum Studies at Leeds, and my PhD in Cultural Geography at Sheffield. I've got a long-standing interest in walking interviews, and that's the mobile method I'm going to talk about today. For my PhD, I looked at walking methods, used them in research around the rural urban economy, so Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and there I explored the question of arts audiencing through walking methods, so how audiences make meaning from artworks. And then at postdoctoral level, I looked at this kind of sticky question of cultural intermediation, and that was as part of a very large HRC project led by Phil Jones that looked at how communities were connected into the cultural economy in the cities of Birmingham and Manchester, and I was the lead researcher in Birmingham. So today I'm going to discuss my argument for pluralising methods, and I'm going to draw on that Birmingham research. A useful start point then is thinking about what we mean by mobility before moving on to discussing how to pluralise thinking and practice around this concept. So, human mobility is defined by Tim Creswell as practice mobility that is enacted and experienced through the body. Creswell identifies the need for a politics of mobility in which walking, along with dancing, driving, flying, running and so forth, is recognised as a practice shaped by different bodies. A politics of mobility might involve the homeless, women or refugees, or indeed communications and infrastructure, as Adi has recognised, for as he writes, mobility, like power, is a relational thing. In addressing a politics of mobility, I advance that a careful consideration towards the social, spatial and cultural politics of using particular methods with different people on the move is needed to understand constellations of mobility. That is, as Creswell has written, particular patterns of movement, representations of movement, and ways of practicing movement that make sense together. This research asks then, how do we make sense of the ways that multiple ethnic and cultural groups converge in the city, and the different attitudes towards and practices of walking in a context of pluralism? I suggest that consideration to the social and cultural implications of the tools we use to engage others and how we represent the environment we live in is particularly timely in a context of increasing diversity in European cities and anxiety over notions of increasing ethnic cultural segregation. It contributes to wider debates on the relationship of power and mobility, but seeks to advance these by arguing for the need to recognise contingent systems of belief, along with intersectional markers of gender and ethnicity, in the design and use of mobile methods. In geography, special attention is needed for greater sensitivity to the role of faith, spirituality and morality, and what that performs in the social, cultural, material landscape, as I argue in my research. And I think that's particularly important in dominant secular liberal spaces, which haven't tended to prioritise looking at issues of faith and religion. So mobile methods are a constituent aspect of the new mobilities paradigm that's gained traction over the last 15 years. Researchers have followed variously people, animals, objects, ideas, images, data, connections in order to trace movement, fixity and blockages, and increasingly have sought new tools to grasp towards our world's seemingly dizzying and increasing complexity. Boucher Uri and Witchgar argue that methodological innovation and diversification are often positioned as a necessary result of the epistemological shifts in mobility theory, in particular interest in non-representational theory and embodiment, and also these arguments have been pursued by Justin Spinney. However, a notion of caution has been urged by Merriman for those researchers who wholly embrace such calls for innovative mobile methods. Instead of abandoning conventional methods altogether, such as interviews, questionnaires, discourse analysis, archival research, Merriman calls for rethinking and reworking of these methods, or expanding and diversifying their repertoire of approaches. Indeed, rather than throwing out the baby with the bathwater, if you like, we might see the merits in triangulating methods new and established and grappling with theory alongside empirical approaches. And I think we see these same kinds of arguments from transport geographies regarding mobilities perhaps as too cultural traditionally, and mobility scholars saying that transport geographies too conventional. You know, these arguments have been made by Shaw and Hess and recently Schwannin to say, actually, no, there's rich heterogeneity and thinking that cuts across both schools. I would go as far as saying that mobile methods are now popular research tools. They've become sort of a la mode. Here is just a snapshot of research using mobile methods. In no way is it exhaustive, but you'll see that there's go-alongs, like walking go-alongs, there's cycling ride-alongs, there's car ride-alongs, there's wheel-alongs, there's photographic, video, and virtual ethnography, and mobile technologies, including GPS. And as I say, this is just a snapshot of what's happening. It's a very rich and quickly expanding subfield. And these different mobile methods have been employed to explore various theoretical interests and concerns, the more than human, so human technology interfaces, human-animal, non-representational theory and practice, embodiment, urban and rural diversity, including anti-racist, feminist and queer studies, health and well-being, social justice, geopolitics and power, psychogeographical and participatory-based practices, and issues of sustainability and globalisation, to name just a few. So my own research practice, as Jen has highlighted, is use walking interviews along with audio recording, photographic and written diaries. But what do I mean by walking interviews? So what is this? What is a walking interview? So at its simplest, a walking interview is an interview on the move. It combines participant observation and semi-structured interviewing, both of which foreground context in knowledge construction. A distinction is made, and it's an important distinction, between a guided walking interview, so that's one where the researcher takes the research to a pre-given destination, and the natural go-along, which is kind of imagined as more participatory, where the researcher shadows the participant on their everyday routine. The productive elements of the go-along are seen as it giving insights into nodes of activity, those places in between, biographical and familial resonances, and social spatial architecture, as Evans and Jones have written. It positions participants' lived and local knowledges as that of the expert, and can decentre, supposedly, the expert knowledge of the academic. And then, as Anderson says, the walking route in a go-along, as determined by the interviewee, can overcome traditional interviewer-interviewee power relations in order to forge something uniquely collaborative. And in doing so, it can facilitate harnessing the power of place. But walking interviews hinge upon the need for research questions to be framed by a place that can be walked, as Evans and Jones say, which means the act of walking will exclude certain types of participants. And these exclusions involve physical impediments, but also social and cultural barriers to walking places. So I contend that as a spatialised and embodied research tool, walking interviews can enable responsive insights into the dynamic, emotional, affectual and physical relations of power-differentiated people within the everyday fabric of urban and rural life. Meanwhile, importantly, in the instances where social and cultural life is not walked for any multitude of reasons, other kinds of knowledge on immobility, connectivity and control in space begin to emerge. And so by revisiting the walking interview with attention to social difference, the normative Eurocentric, masculine, secular and able body through which geographical accounts of walking has typically been imagined and formed begins to be highlighted in its partiality. My observations here are indebted to the contributions of feminist and critical urban geographers who have exposed how the pacing of lives and social relations through the medium of walking is intimately bound with geometries of power. We might see these geometries of power at work in Ingold's argument that walking for pleasure is based on the striding gait of boot-clad Europeans, influenced by the landscape writings of male romantic poets such as William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Or later, in how walking is framed as an everyday practice or tactic by de Soto, writing on Debord the situationist and the typically male figure of the flaneur, where walking deviates from the strategies employed by urban planners, architects and engineers to exert power over citizen behaviour. Identifying both the gendering of leisure walking and social politics of writing on urban walking, Jenny Middleton, here, has argued the emancipatory potential and democratic possibilities of urban walking are far from straightforward and unproblematic, as much of the literature on walking in the city is imbued with a degree of romanticism, whereby walking is often considered without question as a positive urban practice. Hear, hear. Indeed, walking has too neatly been positioned as a political act of emancipation, where citizens have the power to resist and reject the dominant moral and social order written into the cityscape, with walkers held forth as an example of rebellion, freedom and agency. Important here, too, is the work on anxiety and fear in work on spatial mobilities, including that around mental health by Sarah Payne and by Jill Valentine in particular. So, read together, literatures on walking power reveal that there are multiple structural barriers, physical and perceptual, presented in the act of walking for different people, especially, I would say, in the busyness and diversity of the contemporary city. In representing a sense of place, therefore, the multiple ways in which people are included or excluded in the built environment must be fully acknowledged. A lack of social confidence or freedom to take part in a walking interview by migrants, minorities or women, for instance, does not negate nor reduce the legitimacy of that account of public space. Instead, it reveals the mobilities and immobilities that give emphasis to the complex ways in which the public environment of British cities is encoded with very different values, as Mohammed has it. This is particularly pertinent to an analysis of who can or cannot exercise power to shape the visible practices and representation of urban public space and give voice to its different meanings. So now I'll move on to discuss another body of literature just briefly before talking about some of the empirics that emerged through the walking interviews. So in extant scholarship on Muslim women and spatial practice in the city, there are two key tendencies to which this paper now turns, and then I will look towards their points of connection. Geographers on religion looking at Islam have taken as their site and scale of analysis mosques, schools, the home and the body. Firstly, mosques and schools have been the central sites of analysis for Muslim geographies that are informed by a cultural politics approach to explain the place of Islam in society. Institutional nodes in the public realm in this work can be understood as building out of the early theories of religion that designated locations in which religion is cited, the subject, structure of society, institutions, to encourage appreciation of how religious functions in society. Secondly, at the scale of the home, the domestic space preoccupies literature that has been considered the ascribed role of mother and nurturer to Muslim women. By attending to the mobilities of migrant Muslim women in my research, I seek to cut across these gendered analytic binaries of the public and private, revealing points of departure and exchange. And this builds upon work that seeks to unhinge the category and representation of Muslim women through advancing new perspectives on gender and spatialised roles in access to labour markets, political organisation, community and leisure spaces, and educational experiences and aspirations. The site that I'm talking about today is Balsall Heath in South Birmingham. Now, Birmingham, many of you might know, it's a city of just over 1 million in population, and the neighbourhood of Balsall Heath is just south of the city centre. It's just about 2 miles south of the city centre. It's located within a ward called Sparkbrook. So even if you don't think you know Balsall Heath, you might well have heard some media stories about Balsall Heath. It's received considerable attention due to public anxiety over Operation Trojan Horse, an investigation into Muslim extremism in primary and secondary school governance, and more recent protests on LGBT relations education focused outside Anderton Park Primary School. The area was discussed in the Casey report published in 2016, of which nothing was really done, as Louise Casey said, perhaps because of Brexit, meaning that there wasn't such an issue around domestic focus in politics. And also, these debates were around integration, segregation. And the Ted Cantle report update of 2011, that's been a key focal point in the government's controversial counter-extremism prevent strategy, which is manifested visibly at the local level on Balsall Heath by increased securitisation through police security cameras. Ethnically, it's a diverse area. Mostly residents identify as Pakistani Muslim, with a growing share of residents identifying in the most recent census, which was 2011, so quite out of date now, as Arab, and still some Irish and Caribbean residents which had moved there in previous waves of migration, although many have since dispersed to other areas of the city and beyond. So, largely negative media coverage and policy reports of the area centred on conservative Islamic extremism is overlaid upon its reputation as a former red light district, and this has been explored by Phil Hubbard in particular. Here you see an image by Janet Mendelsohn taken of Varna Road in Balsall Heath, and this was the epicentre of the red light district, with up to 200 prostitutes working there at the end of the 1960s. And at the time when Mendelsohn took this photo, she was enrolled in the MA at the Centre for Contemporary Culture Studies under Stuart Hall, so that kind of critical culture studies MA, but that's since been shut down at University of Birmingham. So what you can see here, I suggest, is that Balsall Heath has been sensationalised, therefore, as a place of illicit, dangerous, transgressive behaviour by very different marginalised groups. The neighbourhood has been represented, intervened in and challenged as a problem area, a priority area, as Birmingham City Council would have it, or a kind of badland, as Mustafa Deketch would have it, an unruly migrant space for over 50 years. The research that I did there had two stages to it. So the first stage was a classroom-based exercise, and that was with 26 students. And then the second stage involved the live walking interviews, and that was with 11 students, which was 40 minutes to 180 minutes in duration. The participants were mostly migrants that were first generation from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and Algeria. Time was built into the research process. The initial stage involved developing trust and facilitating learning by attending a number of college classes over a term, and I taught some of these classes. In these classes, the conventional techniques of the walking interview were introduced, so the sorts of techniques that I told you about earlier. For those who did not feel comfortable undertaking a walking interview, we developed the classroom mapping exercise as an alternative means to represent social spatial experience of the neighbourhood that didn't require additional time outside the classroom, and it didn't require walking in public space. The classroom-based exercise involved participants flagging on a large AO map any place that the women had visited in their recreational time, just using simple post-it notes. In the walking interviews, participants were offered choice in how walking interviews were conducted, so they could be done independently or accompanied as part of a friendship group and with children or partners. Also, they were offered a translator, although none took the opportunity to have a translator because they wanted to practice their English with me. There was nevertheless a significant drop-off in participation in the walking interviews. Despite intermediation from a community researcher who worked at the college, a number of scheduled walking interviews were cancelled, primarily for reasons provided with bad weather and memory lapses. Additionally, lack of time due to caring duties for elderly relatives and children and other domestic responsibilities were cited as contributing factors for withdrawal. So Green and Singleton have read the issue of the visibility, as they have it, along perceived lines of cultural and religious transgression. And I think also at play here there's potential tensions over migrant legal status that compound a cautiousness of public participation and engagement in the research. So this slide here just shows a very brief overview of some of the insights from the classroom mapping exercise. It highlights some of the important spaces for people in the study, so parks, the local library, the ESOL College, the Women's Education ESOL College, and ESOL is for English speakers of other languages. It also shows clear variance in social responsibilities and level of independence. So, for instance, you might see that someone says, I go with my daughter to the park, or I go walking for half an hour with my friends, or I go to my sister's for dinner. Reported encounters with public space when they took place tended to be short in duration, often accompanied by children, husbands, extended family or friends, and notably they were rarely taken alone. And so now I will turn to a series of examples drawn from the secondary stage, the live interviews. So in the first example, Aliyah and Haffa asked the researcher to accompany them to a women's only gym and to help enrol Aliyah as a member. Haffa said it was too complicated to join herself. Aliyah sought multiple assurances she would not encounter a man at the gym after observing in the programme a weekly male-only session that was scheduled. In the grocery store, Aliyah checked that tinned food was halal by carefully reading the ingredients list written in Arabic. The researcher myself tried to encourage a participant-led walking interview. Where are we going next? I don't know. Well, where else do you want to go in the area? You're choosing now because I don't know. In this example, a challenge is posed to extant discussion of power relations in walking interviews that if too readily suggested empowerment of the individual is enabled by allowing the participant to lead decision-making. A deferential approach to the cultural authority of the teacher, in this case a university lecturer, myself, was a key contributing factor that frustrated attempts to realign power relations through research design in the walking interview. Further intergenerational asymmetry in power was evident between the participants. The older female led and the younger female followed. Elsewhere, participants regularly asked for reassurance their selected route was suitable and whether the researcher would like to visit anywhere in particular. Rather than empowering the participants, the go-along scenario proved challenging for the researcher. It pushed beyond comfort zones where leading the route meant unwanted authority was assumed, exacerbating any unease in what was already an unusual social and spatial situation. So I think this indicates how the empowerment rationale should be reconsidered when it's held in tension with cultural and social difference and situated hierarchies of power between the researcher and researched. Physical and social risk-taking in its moral dimensions arose as key issues in a number of walking interviews. By example, Fana had lived in Balsall Heath for 17 years after migrating from Yemen. Fana wore a black abaya and headscarf with embellishment. Keen to talk, her shyness was indicated through avoidance of eye contact. Walking along the street, Fana was keen to show the houses where she lived with her husband, with her father and her extended family, all located on the same road as her college. She told me she was married with a child, but her husband worked in Saudi Arabia as he couldn't organise a visa for the UK. As the researcher and Fana walked together along a pavement in Balsall Heath, a car beeped its horn. Fana was visibly upset. She shook her head and quickened her rate of walking and talking. That's rude, I've never seen him before. That's what I'm trying to tell my daughter. Don't talk to strangers. Strangers are bad. Just pretend that you don't know them. No, don't look at them. Just go inside. Fana interpreted this rude street experience through a lens of modesty and honour, further reflecting that men would not beat the horn of a woman at a woman that they knew. So her avoidance of public situations where she might be physically hurt or socially and morally disrespected extended to a nearby park where football and cricket facilities are built close to the children's play area. Taking a route that avoided passing the park, Fana said, "There's too many men down there. They like whistling and everything at women." With insights that add emphasis to the need for faith-based cultural and gender sensitivity when undertaking a go-along, Aisha's primary concern was judgment by other Muslims in the neighbourhood, if observed in close proximity to men, especially if they were behaving indecorously. A student from Afghanistan, Aisha had visited the UK for 3 years and has a husband and daughter. She took the researcher to a local park, but then expressed reservations. I don't like this place. I have to come because of my daughter, who says I like to play here. Asked to expand on this, she replied, to be honest with you, I went yesterday and somebody plays sport behind me. It doesn't look good for me. And as she reflected later on in the interview, it doesn't look clean for me. So, as the bearers of Izzat, or honour, women's encounters with Nahmaram, which is unrelated men, can often be more controlled in Muslim societies and communities, as Muhammad has written. Afshar, meanwhile, has explained that this is because Muslim women tend to be positioned as the transmitters of cultural values and identities and the standard bearers of the group's private and public dignity. These insights chime with the need to feel comfortable in their physical surroundings. As too, other participants said in a separate interview, in Islam mixing's not okay, and they mean gendered mixing, but in this park it's large, so it's okay. So far from harnessing the power of place, as Anderson would have it, the experience of negotiating and navigating the body within a secular, liberal public realm might be perceived as socially and morally transgressive, and in a couple of instances, perhaps even fear-inducing. Yet the informal sociality of the go-along scenario lends itself to engaging with youthful, confident and streetwise subjects for whom talking and walking in their neighbourhood for recreation is already embraced as part of the everyday routine. Two chatty and ambitious 18-year-old British Pakistani twins were keen to guide the research on their usual route around Cannon Hill Park, which they practiced 2 or 3 times a day. The teenagers were fashionably dressed in a style that combined conservative Islamic and contemporary streetwise elements. Mediha and Mamuna wore prominent gold earring hoops and bracelets, carefully drawn black eyeliner and white iPod headphones on display over the material of their black hijabs. Exercising by walking to the park or to the gym was part of their daily practices. For some Muslim women, concern for tarnishing their personal and familial honour can inhibit public behaviours. However, despite the greater the potential for control, due to all of their family, as Mediha writes, or says, living in the area, they openly enjoy engaging in a range of activities, including forms termed haram by some of their peers. And by haram, I mean that which is forbidden by the Prophet and in Islamic law. During the go-along, they introduced the researcher to an immersive exhibition at a local arts centre. They talk animatedly about dancing at special occasions, such as weddings, attending festivals, going to the fun fair, playing on swings, and watching Bollywood films. The mobilities of Mediha and Mamuna and their aspirations point towards their youthful urban identities as second-generation migrants and the opportunities perceived to be available to them in the city. The twins want to be businesswomen and make money. Asked what kind of business, Mamuna replied that she would love to work here. They expressed the desire to live in Balsall Heath forever. Their practice show the limitations of patriarchal reactionary narratives at work within and outside Pakistani communities that reinforce the idea of the women's place as domestically bound, and often that's allied with religion, so religion and culture are kind of mixed up. Thinking through movement with methods, in this instance, therefore, offers critical insights into how social difference meets public life, in culture, the recreation, and in economic imaginaries. So, as with the twins, for some women in the study, walking publicly alone was an everyday practice. Moreover, in these instances, walking for leisure was seemingly uncomplicated. Ours was engaging with public institutions and resources that feature in the typography of the local landscape. Nyla's from Bangladesh and had lived in the area for 15 years since getting married and having 4 children. She was confident, warm and quick to laugh throughout the go-along. She had a route planned. Nyla guided the researcher to a nearby playground which she visited twice a week and spends time with other mothers from the area. Next to the playground is a community centre that's used for children's clubs and weddings. She guides the researcher past the house she takes Quranic lessons in and the primary school playground where her youngest child's enrolled. Passing by her home, she invites the researcher in for refreshments and to meet her husband in an unanticipated detour. We're going in here. Oh, right, okay, great. And so over tea and biscuits, Nyla and her husband discussed his attitude to her everyday recreational walking. They laughed about him relishing getting rid of her every day. She likes her independence, I like my peace, he says. While he doesn't mind her going out walking, as he said, he contends that a lot of Asian Arab men don't like their women walking to places. And that's a direct quote. The statement positions the freedom for women to engage in walking practices as progressive, notably, and it also reveals assumptions that the Asian and Arab women in the area are married, they're heterosexual and conform to a gender hierarchy. So I think these comments expose what's often a thin line between talking about other people's cultural patriarchal narratives and reinforcing them, even if inadvertently. So while the walking interview has limitations, as I've discussed, it's productive, but it also has limits, the method can reveal insights into the embodied pathways of those who are often marginalised and highlight some of the cultural and social structures that may shape individual choices on those pathways. Gillian Rose shows common concerns of time-space geography and feminism, where quotidian paths and constraints are linked to larger structures in society. And that was back in 1993 that she made this point. While undertaken in the physical space of the local neighbourhood, the walking methodology need not reinforce unidimensional linear geometries, for importantly, the usage and discussion of mobile technologies by participants during interviews reveals a constellation of connectivity with different people and places. Fana discussed how her clothes and jewellery were bought from Yemen, where prices were more affordable. Using the social media application WhatsApp, her mum and sister take photographs of dresses, abayas, scarves and jewellery and send them for approval before purchasing and posting the products to Birmingham. Meanwhile, Aliyah explained during her walking interview how she uses Skype to participate in classes with her imam, who teaches from Saudi Arabia. All of the women in the study owned mobile phones, all of them, using them to speak with friends and family in different cities and their countries of origin. The walking interview can therefore make visible often undocumented activities and networks that shape migrant lives in the UK and elsewhere. The local neighbourhood is a powerful signifier, as emphasised when I discussed cultural representation and policy interventions in Balsall Heath as a designated priority neighbourhood. And yet this boundary to some extent is an imaginary. Notions of where the neighbourhood boundary lies was varied in the classroom-based exercise that we did, the participatory mapping. Moreover, everyday routines that took place in the neighbourhood were regularly punctuated by intercity and international phone calls and messages revealing spatial interconnectedness, especially around issues of consumption, family and faith. So now I'll briefly outline some empirical conclusions before discussing some of my takeaways around the methodology. So from Sidaway, security and insecurity are shared master keys that shape topography of landscape and experience of walking in the urban landscape. But in this geographical study of Muslim women in South Birmingham, alternative geometries of power are exposed around family and kinship ties, honour, legal and economic status, and sense of place. For some folded into everyday urban life as social spatial practices that are directed by a geography of fear and anxiety, yet significantly others typify ease and confidence as they spatially negotiate public space, civic services, educational and cultural spaces, and those places in between. Taken together, the accounts caution against overstating and eliding differences and essentialising migrant Muslim women as a category that in turn serves to delimit and reinforce exclusions and border marking, I would say. So in this paper, I've talked about pluralising mobile methods through the example of walking interviews. But where is the plural at work in this discussion? And how should pluralism be engaged further? So, first point here, a heterogeneity of voices is required in research with marginalised groups, including with migrants, women, minority religious groups, and those living below the law. To do this, we need an intersectional framework, I would posit, to understand how social characteristics dynamically act and transform one another and how this can shift in particular contexts, elucidating the dynamic nature of social difference. This impacts research findings, but also uncovers the volatility of walking interviews as method and how all methods need to be understood as actors, if you like, within their geographical and cultural contexts. There's also the need, of course, for different voices, perspectives and bodies in the academy, as this impacts upon the social spatial dynamics of the research encounter and thus the findings drawn. The community intermediary at the Women's College said it would be most appropriate for a female to undertake the research if walking in public, yet other kinds of knowledges and indeed blockages would have come to the fore if I was Muslim, non-white, or lived in the neighbourhood. I lived on the border of the neighbourhood. This speaks to different and multiple axes of insider and outsider that impacts research encounters, and questions who is in the position and has authority in the doing and writing of academic geographical research. There's so much to say on inequities of knowledge production in the academy and beyond, but in sum here I want to highlight that research is always situated, partial and incomplete. Different perspectives would give emphasis to this point and push against the tendency still to presume a kind of universal body and experience that I think is implicit there in mobile methods. I desire to pluralise the method itself by opening up the possibility of mobilities, movement and mooring dialectic, as Uri and Adi have written, in how it is understood and practiced. In this research, the classroom mapping exercise of usual walking practice in the neighbourhood is integral. It's core to the walking interview. Merriman has suggested that mobile methods often combine the conventional and innovative in understanding dimensions of mobility, such as with interviews and photographic diaries. But I want to push the immobilities dimension of this point further by arguing that knowledge of walking practice is enriched by an in situ more dimension in order to account for those who cannot walk or undertake a go-along with a researcher for any multitude of reasons, such as cultural and spiritual issues of visibility, comfort, language, and gendered issues around time and confidence in assuming responsibility for the route. So, in other words, and this is a kind of provocation, but I'm committed to it, walking interviews need not be walked. Okay? And then in the final point here around pluralising mobile methods, I want to come back to the incompleteness and unevenness in research processes. And I think there's a need to grapple with ethical dimensions which unfold in often unexpected ways. For instance, in recognising the limitation of reading go-along as empowering for all subjects, and acknowledging the narrative of participation in co-production knowledge might serve the ethical and epistemological framework of the academic more than reflect the views and needs of the participants. So here I track back to the example of Aliha and Hafa, who did not want to lead the go-along despite my efforts and encouragement, and in turn that was in line with the research methodology of the larger project that I was employed on. So perhaps the wider point here is informed by Saba Mahmood, who argues against the universalising politics of research that applies a liberal political lens to all subjects, whereby female agency is analysed solely in terms of empowerment, autonomy and liberation. Along with my discomfort in notions of my empowerment of marginalised women in all its white imperialist history and research practices, there's also an issue of silencing the subjects and their desires, as well as overclaiming the importance and impacts of our research. So here I'm also thinking about the work of Cook and Guattari on the tyranny of participation and development, where the rhetoric of inclusion is undermined by top-down, hierarchical and unjust exercise of power that can actually serve to reinforce inequalities. Bringing together walking interviews of cultural differences challenges understanding on the realistic extent to which the go-along can decentre authority, realign power dynamics and transform subjectivity in 40 minutes flat. Okay. And so, finally, what's my learning on the move? What would my take-home points be? So 1 and 2, we ought to take account of the relations and dissonances between the interviewer and interviewee on key issues of participation and decision-making. Quite unintentionally, this can be sharpened in attempts to disrupt knowledge hierarchies, given differences of expectation and research dynamics informed by distinct social, cultural and educational backgrounds. Point 3 and 4. These insights add new social moral layers of understanding to both guided walks and the go-along. In my research, reciprocal co-learning in place-based knowledge production indicates the value of the method when it is socially and morally appropriate. Where concern over patriarchal community judgment is felt, in this instance around gender, faith and what constitutes good behaviour, the normative representation of a supposed productive go-along can more accurately lapse into embarrassment and discomfort. So to this end, this paper stresses how qualitative methods ought to be tailored sensitively in order to offer insights into the lives of others, in particular those who experience marginalisation from mainstream society most acutely. The fall in participation from classroom to street in point 5, and finding that orientating the neighbourhood without a practical purpose pushed the boundaries of comfort for some women in study. And this informs assumptions that walking is uniformly positive or even a fairly neutral activity. I would have it that power of place is neither possessed nor harnessed for many. Walking for leisure, often framed as an everyday practice, was highly unusual for most in the study. This advances the need for walking to be recognised as a multi-layered and complex act that cannot be taken for granted, even amongst the able-bodied. And for points 6 and 7 here, the politicised material and epistemological landscape of the neighbourhood means special recognition should be given to the wide-ranging cultural lives and embodied experience of the women engaged in the study. This awareness is even more significant in an area where the population has been stigmatised according to certain symbolic markers, such as mosques, veilings, and protests, as proxies for extremism and segregation. On the issue of representation, my paper suggests the need for care to avoid homogenising narratives of people or places. And in bringing together timely theoretical concerns with the empirical, mobile methods are pertinent foci for a more pluralised and critical way to research urban geographies. Okay, thank you.